Thank you for being so prompt and getting back in on time. As always, the Fish Council agenda is jam-packed, and I've got to keep everything moving along. So with that, we're going to come into our collaborative opportunities for the recovery and restoration of wild Pacific salmon. With that, we have Jennifer Davies, Executive Director, Aquatic Ecosystems Branch, Ministry of Land, Water, and Resource Stewardship. Mike Menier, President and CEO, Pacific Salmon Foundation. Sarah Murdoch, Senior Director, Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative. The Jordan Point, Executive Director, First Nations Fisheries Council, and Gord Sterrett, Executive Director, Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance. The panel is yours. I think Mike is starting, correct?
I'll start.
Or you're starting?
I'll
All right.
start. I like to stand. I can't talk when I'm sitting down. Again, so what we wanted to do, I was talking to Sarah before we started, and I said essentially what we'll do is Mike and I will hum a few bars and the rest will join in. And so what we wanted to do was kind of give some context to the room and then allow the group, our subject matter experts, to kind of come in and start to fill out the conversation. Essentially what happened was we talked earlier this morning in Tier 1 about the decline in Pacific salmon and how urgent that we were starting to see that decline occurring. Of course, all of the different impacts that were occurring affected many different people, many different organizations, were caused by many different factors and stressors. And Mike and I talked about it over a year ago. And Mike was saying, well, why don't we have a symposium? Why don't we have a conference about it? And we'll work with you on it. And we said, well, from the Fisheries Council perspective, we don't want to just have a one and done meeting. We'd rather have like a series, something that's ongoing, because some of you may remember we had a fisheries conference in 2018. We got together, we did a report, and we sent the report, and it sits on a shelf. And what we wanted to do was keep the conversation alive. So we settled on the notion of having what we call Pacific Salmon Action Dialogue Series, which was like an ongoing conversation. And we would be breaking up the conversation to invite different people to come and talk about the issues that are affecting them, that are affecting Pacific salmon, things that we can work on, lessons learned, best practices. And so that's what we decided to do. And we decided very early on to work with the Pacific Salmon Foundation to get this conversation going. We were supported by some very good, capable young people. And Mike, how's that for starting us off down the road?
I'm not young.
You're younger than me.
Jordan.
Yes.
No, thank you, Jordan. Mike Menier with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. And thank you, Jordan, for inviting me. And thank you to Musqueam for having us here today. It's an honor. Maybe I'll just say a couple words about the Pacific Salmon Foundation. You may or may not know much about us. We're a nonprofit organization. We've been working since the late 80s, mostly giving grants to local community organizations who want to fix streams and rivers, run small hatcheries, education programs. Very grassroots community oriented, including a fair number of grants made to indigenous nations and organizations over the years. But in the last 10 years or so, we got much more involved in science, and as we got more involved in science and research, we also learned that there was a role for PSF to play in we had a lot of these relationships developed over the province and trying to bring people together because we have this crisis around salmon. And, for us too, it is about the salmon, but it's also about, at the Salmon Foundation, doing better and learning and being committed to reconciliation and needing help with that. And having had a relationship with Jordan for many years, we reached out to him. So this, in many ways, is, of course, focused on salmon. We've got to save our salmon. We've got to rebuild them and protect them. That's our mission as a nonprofit. But it's also about how do we, as an organization at the Pacific Salmon Foundation, learn from indigenous nations, leaders, organizations. And I'm really proud that one of the things that we did was we kind of started at the top, and we started inviting indigenous leaders onto our board of directors. And so we now have Murray Ned on our board of directors, and we also have Gord Sterrett here on the board of directors for the organization. And this is helping us significantly in terms of our planning, our objective setting, and the work that we're doing. And I would say that the voice of folks like Gord and Murray on our board is very much leading us in this direction that Jordan is speaking about, which is that it is up to all of us. We all have to come together. There's not really a plan to save salmon. There are a lot of people, entities, organizations, governments committed to salmon and working to restore salmon, but we often show all these bubbles on this little diagram that we have. The bubbles are kind of disconnected. And so what we're hoping to do with Jordan, with First Nations Fisheries Council, is to bring people together, hopefully develop a common plan, but to look at some other models and examples, not only in British Columbia, but in Canada and even in the US, for where groups have come together, maybe despite even differences along the way, come together and figured out ways to work together and are having some success. And we've had, we've got our slides up here now. Thank you, Astrid, for all your work on this. Oh, great, thanks. You know, just a kind of a word here on process. We've had some funding from the Sitka Foundation to put this together. We've hosted 4 gatherings to date. Half of those were virtual, half of them were in person. And again, really, the emphasis has been on acknowledging that we have this highly complex situation for salmon. Life cycle complex, climate change complex, jurisdictional complexity, and that we have to figure out ways to overcome and maybe utilize this complexity to bring people together to try to have a common vision. And Jordan is always very big on this in our meetings and our conversation, is we've got to start with the vision. And we feel like we've made some very good headway and progress in that regard with our first 4 sessions. And then the next sort of phase of this is to really figure out what are some models that we could potentially pilot to get on with the action side of things. This has been, from my board of directors, the admonition to me is this can't be process for proceedings and reports. It has to be process for progress and advancing action, moving things forward for salmon. And so when Jordan made that recommendation that we not just have one conference once a year, but we actually have an ongoing series, that we integrate learnings from people like Cowichan Watershed Board, the Washington State folks, Nicola Governance, and many others, this was a big step forward for us. So that's kind of where we are. We've had these sessions. We've looked at a number of entities like the Washington State Recovery Model, the Cowichan Water Board, Okanagan Nation Alliance, the Great Lakes Basin Recovery Program. We've interviewed these people. We've heard testimony from them. And grateful, of course, that friends like Sarah Murdoch from the federal government and James Mack from the provincial government were there to listen as part of some of these sessions. I think we're now at the point, and maybe I asked Jordan to kind of chime back in here, I think we're at the point where we had to kind of test the question of, do people want to come together? And I think we've had very positive feedback in that regard, that people do want to collaborate. We do need a plan and a structure that works. And I think maybe my last point before I pass it back over to Jordan is, you know, one that really a framework and a model for coming together that really respects authority and rights of First Nations and is First Nations led. And this is where I think we've learned a lot at the Salmon Foundation through this process, and are very much looking forward to being a partner in bringing this forward, but it has to be First Nations led.
Thanks, Mike. That's a lot of good context. And you'll recall, for those of you that were in Tier 1 this morning, we put up the diagram that shows the Fisheries Council as a convener and opening up the space for having this dialogue. And the one thing that we did during our Salmon Action dialogues was to really gel around the notion that people really didn't want to see separate strategies. We had First Nations leadership telling us we need our own strategy. We've had the provincial government saying we need a salmon strategy. And of course we have the federal government saying we need a salmon strategy and we're going to be rolling this out. The message that we received from people in our Salmon Action Dialogue series was that they didn't see the efficiency of having multiple strategies. They rather saw the efficiency of working together on one strategy and working to coordinate economies of scale and efficiencies to develop that common strategy. The question is, and a lot of people talk about this, is we don't have process for the sake of process, but that we have process to facilitate outcomes. And so the notion for today is for us to bring that conversation forward. We took it to First Nations leadership, we took it to our board, and people were going, yeah, that makes sense. We should be working on one strategy. Instead of going to 3 different meetings, you know, I hear from First Nations all the time, I don't need another meeting to go to. And we have meeting fatigue, so if we can reduce that and get people working on one common issue and working on one strategy and bringing all of our authorities to the table and say, how do we do this to the best outcome collectively, then that's the objective. So what we wanted to do today was really invite, this is the part where Mike and I start to hum along a song and the rest can join in, is really about what do you guys think about having the notion of collaboration around one strategy to protect and restore Pacific salmon, because that's the feedback we got through our Salmon Action Dialogues. In fact, at the last session we had at the SFU building was people wanted to start a declaration. Let's rally around a declaration that says we're all in this together and we all want to work on this together. So that's kind of where we're headed today, is to engage with you, the participants, First Nations, government, NGOs, other interested participants, about the need for us to be looking at, are we prepared to invest in this conversation? So that's kind of enough said from me today to get the ball rolling and humming a few tunes here and see if the rest want to join in on it. But I think our facilitator is going to ask some questions.
I am. I get to play Phil Donahue or something, if you guys even remember who Phil Donahue is. That's a test of how old are people in this room. All right. Okay, here's your question. What were your key takeaways from these dialogues? What actionable outcomes would you like to see resulting from the opportunities for collaboration highlighted throughout SADS? And I'm going to start with Sarah.
Thanks, Michelle. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for the Fnfc for the invitation today, and just recognize that we are on unceded Musqueam territory. And I have to say, it's not my first time in the building, but I'm always inspired by this space, and want to thank the hosts for the lunch. I really enjoyed the sessions, as you mentioned, Mike. I managed to attend, I think, both of them, or a couple of them so far. And in particular, the face-to-face one was the first time since COVID I'd actually been in a room with people for a couple of days. That was really good. I really appreciated, and you guys hit on it, is we need to balance that process and convening, bringing people together with action. And you can't have one without the other. Like, people are going to get tired of just going to meetings for the sake of meetings, but there are so many people out there doing things to support salmon and save salmon. And I think if we can harness that energy, as you were saying, in a more coherent and strategic way, it'll be much more impactful and powerful. So in terms of your ingredients for success, I kind of like how they all blend together, or they're all sort of self-reinforcing, but I guess I would really love an opportunity for, what I also heard was that there are many partners out there, stewardship groups, levels of government, across the board, across British Columbia, interested in this work, but they really see the BC government, the federal government, and First Nations needing to show leadership, as you've got in one of your squares. And I think you've got that commitment, or there is that commitment. And if we can figure out what are some initial key priorities, some tangible projects or areas of focus that we can work on, and then build on that. One of the things I've noticed in sort of addressing the salmon crisis or salmon declines is we often get into a bit of analysis paralysis. It's such a complex issue. There's so many things we could be doing and should be doing that then it gets frustrating because we're sitting in meetings and having good discussions. But if we can figure out early on, and Jordan and I talked about this, what are some, maybe even on one hand, some initial projects we can work on that really shows the strength of all three levels of government, Indigenous, BC, and feds coming together, then we can build on that and build more of an adaptive approach rather than getting it perfect out of the gate. And I really felt that sort of crystallizing at those sessions, and I'm interested in definitely seeing where that could go.
Thank you, Sarah. Jennifer.
Am I on?
Yeah, you're on.
Thanks. First, I just need to pause and say I'm actually James Mack. So my assistant deputy minister is James Mack. His entire family got COVID on the weekend. He was very excited to be here, so he sends his regrets and apologies, but that was the only reason we thought him being a vector of transmission wasn't a good idea. I also need to take a moment and say I live and work on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Sankis and Esquimalt, and I grew up in the interior on the territory of the Karistikani, particularly the Slatin and the Natlewutin. And having that kind of a background is really helpful from both a coastal and interior perspective when we're talking about salmon. A couple of things around for the province. You'll hear us speaking more and more about a salmon lens. We've had, in kind of the integrated resource management sphere, once you start trying to deal with a single issue unto itself, you usually don't find the solution. So we want to be looking to how do we apply a salmon lens on kind of all of the ways we do business in the resource management sphere of things. Chief this morning talked about cumulative effects. So salmon condition is a really big, it's a result of hydrological and watershed management and all of those pieces. So we need to be looking at that complexity, but we've also got some tools and ways that we've used with other resources that we can apply to the salmon lens. I would also say that for a lot of you, British Columbia hasn't really been an active partner in salmon management with you. And there's a number of excuses for that. But I do want to draw on this really big shift in the paradigm that a lot of the integrated resource management for British Columbia was based on the terrestrial side of things. A lot of you here have worked on forestry. And we've had a lot of regulations and legislation that's based on minimizing harms. Now we're at a place where we have such drastic issues with the management of our watersheds and our salmon that mentality no longer can be in place. We talked earlier about actually changing regulations and legislation. So as simple as switching out from minimizing harms to actually putting some equivalency, for those that are familiar with it, with fishery-sensitive watersheds. So we need to start building that into how we manage, because frankly, wild salmon production is a result of habitat management. And habitat management, the land and the water management, the province has all kinds of those authorities around it. So that's an integral piece that needs to be in the mix. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. But that's definitely kind of where the province is at. How do we bring the salmon lens? Where should we collectively focus, as Jordan was saying, in terms of getting some early wins and some momentum as we move forward on what is a complex issue, but can be addressed.
Thank you. Mr. Starrett.
Thanks, Michelle. I guess some of the lessons I learned from participating both on the steering committee, but also in the Salmon Action Dialogue series, was that we all need to be on the same page. Too often we're fractured, we're looking after our own interests, when if we're all working together, we can make progress, and we have the support of leadership when we're doing that. If we're all over the place, we're never gonna get anywhere. And it's just, I mean, it's been said enough, but collaboration. But with collaboration also comes recognition and decision making. Being able to make those decisions and together, not having to go back and have a decision made for you when we're looking out for the best interests of the salmon. And I guess that's what I learned from participating in the Salmon Action Dialogue series, and I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Gordon. I'll go to Mike and then Jordan for last word.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, thank you, everyone, for your comments. And want to acknowledge, Gord and other members of the First Nations Fisheries Council leadership who really have been a part of these all along the way. And I'm grateful to have Gord wearing both hats, because he can help me at the PSF board and as well in the Fnfc. But a couple of things I just wanted to share that were real standouts for me as we listened to these other groups from around the US and Canada talk. One was the Washington State folks and their model. And they're facing many of the same challenges for their salmon, our salmon. And the simple point that they made was that about 20 years ago, they decided that top-down was not working, that we needed to have bottom-up approaches to rebuilding wild Pacific salmon and protecting them. And I think that makes sense in our context here in British Columbia. And to me, it's one of the things that excites me about the Salmon Foundation being involved and maybe looking for some of those low-hanging fruits that Sarah was referring to. Is we have this network within our organization of various grassroots, 300 plus some grassroots organizations and indigenous organizations that are already doing work for salmon. They're ready to go. And I think we have a great foundation of leadership and knowledge at the grassroots watershed level to work bottom up. And then the last point that I would make that was really an aha for me as the leader of a non-Indigenous, nonprofit organization that's working on reconciliation personally and as an organization. And it was at the Cowichan Water Board. And one of their governing principles is that if an issue on the agenda does not receive consensus, and there is a sense that this issue may engender a lack of trust among the participants, then it is automatically tabled. It's put off. So to me, it's creating shared will, but governance models where we have these understandings with each other, and where at the end of the day, yes, it's about salmon, but we've got to get there through trust. And always finding ways to build and maintain that trust was a big aha for me from the sessions. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Mike. Jordan?
I don't think that there's a lot that needs to be said further than what we've already done. I think it's self-evident to people in the room, to people that are watching virtually, that Salmon are at a critical space in time, and if we don't do something, we might be telling our grandchildren about this wild, mysterious, incredible creature that no longer exists. I don't want to be doing that to my grandchildren. I'm sure you don't. And so the real energy is about, let's do something about that. Let's put aside our differences. Let's work for the altruistic greater good on something that matters to all of us. So as Mike has indicated, I don't think this is one of those issues that's going to fragment us. I think it's going to unify us towards getting to a good place in a good way, as our teaching is. So thank you.
All right, thank you. And thank you to the panel. That's a wrap. Some of you are staying, some of you are staying, and some of you are leaving the stage.
Are you giving a...
You're giving a gift now.
I'm giving that to who now?
Mike.
Oh, Mike, my good friend Mike. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, we're just kicking Mike and Jordan off.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Oh, we got a picture here. Okay.
All right, thank you for that panel. We're going to go right into our next panel. Jordan, you can stay if you'd like. You don't have to stay.
I don't have to stay. I don't need to.
I can.
You want me to stay? Oh. All right, I'll stay. You want
All
me to
right.
stay?
Maybe he'll start moderating the session. All right. So we have a plenary dialogue today on trilateral coordination and recovery and restoration of wild Pacific salmon. And I've introduced them before, but they're still here, which is great. Jennifer Davis, Sarah Murdoch, and Gord Starrett. These flow into each other. That's why I've kept them up here. And Jordan Point.
So maybe I'll give a little context to this conversation too. When we were building the agenda, we thought about the need for us, if we're going to be working on a common salmon strategy and developing a trilateral conversation between three levels of government, Indigenous, provincial, and federal, it would be good for us to talk about models that we've already done that with, such as Big Bar or others. So that's the context of why we wanted these people here to be speaking.
All right. And I do have 3 guiding questions for this panel, and I'm going to start right in with, what are fundamental learnings that you have experienced resulting from participation in other trilateral processes? How could these learnings be applied to collaboration in recovery of wild Pacific salmon populations? And I will start with Jennifer.
I've had the privilege and luxury of actually being involved in quite a few, and I've had the privilege in my position to actually be able to go forth and just jump into the unknown and say, how do we figure this out together? So I think that, you know, coming from inside the bureaucracy, and I use that term as just, it's the civil servants, we're a bureaucracy, that ability to actually have that authority and ability to take a risk is not always there. So I think about Big Bar, and in the emergency response side of it, at the time I had a statutory role, so I was able to go into the forum where we're trying to figure out what we're doing and say, I cannot go forward without First Nations. It's part of my statutory obligations. I don't know what that looks like. And so sometimes that can be scary for governments, but in this situation I could push forward. And so DFO then kind of was also like, yeah, let's figure this out, and how do we do this? And we found him and looped Gord into it. So what I found was I'd had some previous experience with a bunch of different nations, but in this realm, the First Nation Fisheries Council. And so when I got the call on a Friday afternoon that we've got this emergency event, DFO is actioning, how is BC going to happen? I called Jordan and said, I don't know what to do here. I know I want to be collaborative. This is new to me. And I got some advice. from DFO, and we kind of got things going really, really quickly in terms of a trilateral approach. One of the things that Gord and I'll give Bonnie Antcliffe from DFO at the time was the DFO rep and myself from the province. One of the things that we kind of talked about really quickly was trilateral kind of unification around what we want to do, but unilateral or bilateral ability to deliver based on our legislative and authorities, because we didn't want to get slowed down. It's an emergency response. So I find that's a takeaway as well, particularly for the province, because of what I said earlier, the habitat management side of things. DFO is a great partner, but there's a lot of things that we do on behalf of the province that we just run forward on and need to be done in a considered way with salmon. So building the relationship, I felt I could jump into a space and I wouldn't get beaten up for getting it wrong. I'd get help to start getting it right. And at the same time was Big Bar. We had collaborative work going on in Interior Fraser Steelhead, collaborative work going on Fraser sturgeon recovery. So just trying out those things, and I use a quote from Jordan a fair bit, is being brave enough to kick the can down the road. You know, sometimes you kick the can and it goes sideways, but you go over and you kick it back onto the road. And to me, that was a really good metaphor for just how to approach this without getting too caught up in getting it wrong, because we're all figuring this out together. At the same time, through all of this work, recognizing and honoring that different nations want to involve themselves in different ways, and the rights holders are different as well. So with Big Bar, again, to use that as an example, wanting to make sure we had Indigenous perspectives embedded into the actual command structure, in the executive structure, that was with Gord. But then how do we also communicate across all of the nations that are interested? So we had these big, broad communication pieces. We got a leadership council was mostly elders that kicked in. So once we all kind of put our minds together and kind of thought about what we want to do in terms of communication, the solutions started coming out. And I want to give one quick story here. Partnerships should not be scary because we all have the same objective. And the story I share inside the bureaucracy is we were trying to figure out, it's coming to the last days of the early Stuart sockeye, and we're trying to figure out what do we do? Do we start catching them and shipping them, or what do we do? And DFO had just put in these amazing monitors up the stream to kind of count fish. And a flood came down from Prince George, wiped them out. And we were sitting there going, what do we do? And the First Nations that were part of the technical group and the incident command group kind of went, well, we can go over to our traditional sites and go do some dip netting and see what we can find. And I go, that's crazy because your traditional sites are on cliffs. I think that's crazy, but yeah. So they went out and they came back by that afternoon and gave us some information of what they had found. And so that evening, Gordon, Bonnie, and I were actually able to make some decisions about moving fish. And we used that traditional knowledge, the traditional methods, was really informative. Like, it was core to making decisions. So I like that example because it's not like nations need to be directly in the conversation space. You have your own rights, you have your own knowledge that just enhances how we go forward. As we do that in process, there's some scary bits and government needs to move and that sort of stuff. So that's where I like to focus my time, is trying to move the organization forward with that stuff. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Sarah?
I'm just wondering if you need to remind me of the question, Michelle.
The question. What are the fundamental learnings that you have experienced resulting from participation in other trilateral processes? How could these learnings be applied to collaboration in recovery of wild salmon populations?
Okay, thanks. I have to say I agree a lot with what Jennifer's already laid out, so I'm not going to repeat, but just to pick up on a couple themes, I do think it's true that nothing brings people together like a crisis, unfortunately, but fortunately in this case. And so, you know, I do think there is an authentic willingness from folks to sort of set personal things aside, set past history maybe behind, and at least trust trying something different and trying something in new ways. And I certainly would say that, you know, receiving the direction and the commitment around PSSI, it was the way the federal government's signaling a willingness to be part of this bigger conversation. I do think, though, also there is something about us just reconfirming and making sure we are all pointed in that same direction, and then And then, yeah, taking that first step, kicking the can down the road, doing some things, and then circling back and evaluating how that goes. I think that's one thing, that not getting it perfect the first time, but being willing to try things is good. Recognizing that everyone around a table has different tools in their toolbox that can contribute to the conversation is also key. And I do know, though, I guess one of the things I learned particularly from Big Bar as well is, and Gord has much more experience with it, he may want to speak to it, is how do we have enough people mobilize, the capacity thing on that quadrant, to sort of move some of these pieces forward in a meaningful way, but also keep other people in the loop and feel that, so there's that broader trust of what's going on. Because I do know we know from experience that a lot of the best salmon work is done at the local scale. But some of the things that we need to be considering, the big drivers of decline, are going to require regulatory, major policy change that probably best done at a provincial scale. So how do we have everybody in the room, but not have everyone in the room all the time? And I am really intrigued by the Leadership Council concept that was brought forward by the First Nations involved with the Big Bar response as a way for regularly touching in with I know on some calls there was folks from the AFN, the Leadership Council, and also local chiefs, local fisheries biologists, you name it, people representing nations at different scales, and they could ask their questions, answer what's going on, and then we had access to the technical committee on a regular basis. So it's finding people who can be pulled out of their day job to really focus and move these issues forward, but also making sure we are communicating to those outside and checking in and making sure we have that broad mandate and support would be something that I would definitely want us to see we build a path forward. Thanks.
All right. Mr. Sterrett?
I think it's all been said. Well, no, thank you very much, and appreciate that. I guess a willingness to work together and resolve the problem was what brought us all together, and we figured out different mechanisms through our respective leadership, I guess, to ensure that we were doing the best job that we could do. And I think that's important. And communication, Sarah just mentioned communication, and that was what it was. That's what I'm sort of alluding to, is that we had the First Nations leadership panel. We were making decisions in real time on a daily basis, sometimes 3, 4, 5 times a day. And there was times when it'd be one call from Bonnie or Sarah or Jen to their assistant, their deputy minister or whoever. Then there was me on behalf of First Nations, and we had the First Nations leadership panel. If there was decisions that had to be made, and to the First Nations leadership, hats off that we would convene a meeting at a moment's notice. That gave me the mandate, the ability to make those decisions and proceed and try to do the best thing we could for those fish. I mean, it was all about the fish, and we all agreed that it was about the fish. And again, it was we weren't looking after. I mean, we were looking after our interests about the fish, but we weren't protecting our interests. Just to, if you know what I mean. Anyway, so I think that was huge. I think having that ability, making those decisions in real time, communications again was huge. Being able to reach out, having weekly updates on what was going on. It's got to be an open process. We can't just do a closed process, hope that the outcomes are going to, at some point in time, somebody's going to call you on it if it's a closed process. And I think it's got to be an open and transparent process. Decisions that are being made, and I think that, I mean, those are key issues. And it's probably one of, I said it before, being involved in various processes and making, as I alluded to, making decisions real time. It's probably one of the best processes that I've been involved in for a long time. Right from the Joint Executive Steering Committee, we still meet every week. We were having a meeting here about an hour ago. We still meet, we provide updates, we look forward what we're going to do next and lessons learned. We have technical tables that are making collaborative decisions on whether we're enhancing a stock or how many we're enhancing or what we're doing with the fish at a technical level, and what streams we're going to. I mean, right down to the grassroots level, and we're all making those decisions collaboratively, and it's huge. It's an important process to learn from, and I think with PSSI coming into the picture, that we can transition what we're doing seamlessly, almost seamlessly, maybe not seamlessly, but almost seamlessly, to address some of the issues that PSSI was established for. Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan.
So one thing that I think needs to be said, and I know my colleagues at the provincial table will remember this because I've beat it into their heads quite a bit in the last 6 months, is the need for enduring funding or resourcing. It's amazing what we can do when money is not the issue. You know, sometimes you have the ability to cross paths with people and they're talking about a problem and somebody will pipe up and go, oh, if money's the problem, there's no problem. Yeah, you know, if you've ever been around somebody like that, they're really fun to work with. But our problem here is that when crisis arises, there's no problem. There's no money problem. We'll get more money. And we'll go to treasury. We'll run a deficit. Whatever government decides to do, it's not a problem. When it comes to working with First Nations, there's always a problem because we don't know where the money is coming from. Is it coming from a program? Is it coming from GNC? Is it fixed? Is it flex funding? Is it grant? What? We don't know. But you know one thing for sure, it's not enduring. It's not there as core funding for the foreseeable future. So how do you build capacity? Somebody mentioned that earlier today. It's capacity. When you needed somebody to go dip netting, those people knew how to do it. But you know what? Same thing I was mentioning earlier about guardians. Well, guardians would be great to have, but you know what? We laid them off 6 months ago because we didn't have any more money for them. And so the real critical thing in working together and building these models, if we're going to go somewhere, and I've been saying this to the point where I think the province is tired of hearing me say it, it's about enduring funding. It's about building structures that make sure that we're here, because Mike Menier mentioned the Washington State model. One of the things they identified right away was, you know what? You got to have that HR capital. You need human resources to be there when a problem arises or something needs to be done, and we can't overlook that. We need to commit to that. So the main thing that we always are looking at, and I, with my management brain, I'm always looking at, okay, how do I fund it? How do I resource it? How do I make sure people are sitting there when we need to get the work done? And I can't, especially those of you that know it, in this COVID environment, it's hard to hang on to people. It's hard to get them to work in Vancouver. It's an expensive city. You need to have the resources to have people there, or else they go somewhere else. So it's usually not a thought when you're, because I used to work in government. You don't really think about the budget. I don't think about the budget, right? Somebody else worries about that. So we need to make sure that we're thinking about this in terms of like our relationship and moving forward and building capacity with First Nations collaboration. If we're going to be building this trilateral conversation, we need to be thinking about long-term, over the horizon, how do we build enduring funding for this type of program?
Thanks, Jordan. All right, the second question. Acknowledging that salmon recovery habitat restoration is large in scope, where do you think trilateral collaboration could be most effective? Who wants to take that on first? Sarah?
I'll take a stab at it. I'm sure Gordon and Jen have stuff to say as well. For me, actually, this is an old Jordan quote from like a decade ago. I don't know if you still do it as much, Jordan, but the scales conversation, you know, and I think there's nothing better than salmon to talk about, especially addressing salmon declines and the drivers of the decline, to realize you have to operate at different scales. So obviously we can't be everywhere at once, but I would love to see us moving forward in tangible ways at both the local, you know, the local scale, the watershed scale, and the provincial scale, at least with some pilot projects there. As I mentioned, you know, some of the major drivers of decline, we're hoping with PSSI to be doing more work in our science branch, for instance, bringing people together to talk about climate change, and just came back from a successful high seas expedition working with other countries around what's happening to the salmon out in the high seas and marine environment. That's sort of the big macro scale. But through BC, SHRIF, and other programs, we're also excited to work with groups like PSF and individual nations around concrete, tangible, both roundtable processes and actual projects at their local scale. So I would love to see us doing more of both. Setting a table for where we're going to have those conversations around the bigger policy pieces, the bigger things that can address more the systemic drivers of decline, and then at the same time supporting rebuilding planning and strategies at the local scale.
All right, Jennifer.
So obviously I've got a provincial lens on this, and as was said earlier, there's cumulative effects. It's a complicated area. So we've started a few areas with some advice, and the province is always willing to kind of shift and move on this stuff. So we're kind of looking at it from building blocks. So one of the fundamental things that's required to reestablish healthy environments for wild salmon is the healthy ecosystems. And so one of the initiatives, you've probably heard about the watershed security strategy. Under that, how do we actually get that baby going? Well, we've got the water table now, and my colleague, Executive Director Ted Zimmerman, is sitting in the room as well. And so the Fnfc has been really helpful for us, and we're saying, like, we've had a conversation around why aren't we talking about salmon first versus watershed, and we kind of go from the provincial perspective. If we can actually start changing how we monitor, how we evaluate watershed condition, and then require changes in management practices, that's going to be a fundamental change agent for us all. At the same time, we're looking at kind of specific areas for protection. So also in the room is my colleague, Charlie Short, the ED with marine side of things. So we've got the marine area planning, the LOU in place. So there's some elements that we've been kind of playing around with for about 5 years, getting some advice on, and kind of moving forward. So I kind of look at short-term and long-term. So long-term, if we really want to change the condition for salmon, it's a habitat issue, and things like the watershed security strategy. Hopefully a bunch of you are involved in the collaborative stewardship framework initiatives. That's more of a regional scale. Or land use planning, and I'll tell you, if you go in there and the bureaucrats are telling you that salmon is not on the table, call me, because it can be. These are meant to be what the Indigenous parties want as priorities for integrated resource management. Selfishly, I have a number of programs as well, and one is around habitat restoration. And it was started one of the very first comments. I don't have a map that actually shows me the critical habitat. The salmon spawning grounds, major cooling areas. So I'm coming in post-atmospheric river event trying to organize 3G, where our priorities are. And I thought, damn, it would really be nice to actually have that information. I don't need to go collect it. The nations know this stuff. So is there a way that we can we do that? Can we get that information? So I think that, short-term, smaller things like, sounds small, but it's actually not, because if you've got the inventory of the habitat, the critical habitat, that can help drive all kinds of things. So that's a very tangible thing in my mind that we could do fairly quickly. But also we need to have the system changes. So making sure the nations are plugged into a bunch of these initiatives in the way that works for you. And then the third thing, we keep talking about how do we actually find the priorities. So we're working right now on updating the Memorandum of Understanding between the First Nation Fisheries Council and the Province of British Columbia. When we first did that one, it was a very enabling, supportive environment, which, as I said earlier, was really helpful to the bureaucracy because it wasn't scary. We're just work together. Now we're able to put a bit more into it, and to echo Jordan, we've created an enduring relationship. It has to have some enduring supports and resourcing to it as well. So we're talking about that, don't have an answer, but just to echo Jordan's point, that is a really critical piece.
Thank you. Gord.
Thanks, Michelle. Similar answer. I mean, collaboration needs to be at every level. It needs to be at the local level, the watershed level, and the provincial. And I mean, sometimes even, we look at Chinook and whatnot, we're probably looking even more dividing the province in half. But that collaboration should be there, and there should be opportunity for different experts or you talked about water, bringing water, thinking about the water and what the issues are there, and then filling in some of those gaps. But it's got to be a very active, proactive process where you can bring in responses and answer questions and not willing to take, again, be willing to take risks and kick that can if it goes sideways, bring it back, kick it back into the center and keep it going straight. But it requires an evolving process, and it requires you be fluid and being able to bring in different elements and different experts to answer questions as we're trying to address an issue. And in our case, I guess we're trying to address the issue of declining fish, salmon stocks in the province, and it's not just about the Fraser. We're looking at the same issues on the Skeena, we're same issues on the Nass, same issues in the transboundary rivers, and it's just, yeah, and it takes a lot of capacity, it takes a lot of resources, but like I mentioned earlier, if everybody's willing, I think we can accomplish what we're setting out to do.
All right. My final question for this panel. What are the most significant outcomes you think could come from working together? Do you see opportunities for quick wins in working together trilaterally? Gord, you're first.
Say the question again, please.
I'll even put on glasses so I might read it correctly. What are the most significant outcomes you could think could come from working together? Do you see opportunities for quick wins in working together trilaterally?
Well, realizing that we have our resource available into the future, and for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, 7 generations out, I think is probably the most important. And the second part, well, sorry.
What are the quick wins?
Quick wins is just get in there and rebuild one stock at a time, and being able to monitor that.
Awesome, thank you. Sarah?
I think for me that it's taking a two-prong approach. So identifying some quick wins, and I have a couple of ideas, but also working on some of the more transformative shifts. And I'm interested in that idea of that, what did you call it, Jordan? The enduring structures. And you know what I've been told is it's going to take 2 or 3 cycles of salmon, which is a lot longer than a federal budget cycle, to know we're on the right path. And so that's the challenge we've put forward, and that's the challenge I've received back from Ottawa. And so, yes, people want to see some early action, some early wins, but we also have, I think, a mandate together to be building those fundamental structures that are going to improve things for the longer run. So I like the idea of, you know, picking a stock where maybe there's already some momentum, but maybe struggles in terms of, you know, year-to-year funding or not quite enough capacity. Particularly that's focused on taking an ecosystem-based approach to rebuilding, and learning what they've done right, and supporting them and doing it as a bit of a test or a pilot, and then seeing how we can extend it further. And I know there's some great work happening in watersheds all around the province. So, you know, picking a few of those, investing in them, but also documenting what they're doing right and wrong, and building a bit of an approach that others can take would be a great way to start, I think.
Awesome. Jennifer?
Well, I think I've kind of given some quick wins, but maybe I'll just say that, you know, you'll hear the province. We talk a lot about collaborative management. We don't talk a lot about consultation. That obviously has its place, but what we want to be building here is ways that we, three governments, come together with our respective jurisdictions, line ourselves up, and like I said at the start, it could be unilateral, bilateral, and trilateral, but if we're all putting our cards on the table to get to that same end point, it can be pretty amazing what we can do. So collaborative management, co-design, willingness to throw what I don't know what I'm doing out there and work with to try to figure it out. I just think that I'm hoping you're going to be seeing more and more of that from the provincial civil service coming out. And like I said, we're doing our homework around, I think you had a diagram of how DFO works this morning. You probably need one for BC. And one of the things we've done is, like, it's hard to work if you don't have a good partner. So that's partly why we've got the ministry reorganization to land, water, and resource stewardship. It's partly why you've got an ADM, James Mack, and his 4 EDs. We all used to be in 4 different ministries, and we're now one. So we're trying to build some cohesion to amplify the importance of the fish and water resources and how we do integrated management in the province. So even with that lens, always open to suggestions and help and support on how we kind of make that happen throughout a pretty large institution.
Thanks. And for final word, Mr. Point.
Make it sound so dramatic. You know, there's an old saying about, I think, one of the founding forefathers of the United States talked about, and these truths we hold to be self-evident. And we know that salmon, when they go out into the ocean and they come back, they don't stop at Mission and shake hands and say, okay, now we're crossing over into provincial jurisdiction there, so we'll pass it off and all that. So to me, we all need to be working together. When we get into the terrestrial side of the protection, when we get into the migratory path out in the harvest areas, we're involved in all of this together. And so to me, this is self-evident that we need to be working together. And so the quick wins for me is, like, let's just get on with it. Let's just accept that's where we're at. We've been working together quite extensively since, at least since the Sparrow decision came down, and we started with an Aboriginal fisheries strategy. And then the resourcing came and First Nations started to get really involved in programs. So the main objective is nobody's going anywhere very soon. We're not leaving, governments aren't leaving. The sooner we learn how to share the workload, share a vision, I think that's where we need to be going. So, thank you.